Coming up on this edition of the Black Vault Radio, Joshua P. Warren enters the vault to talk about his trip to Area 51 and a discovery he made along the way that may just rewrite the scientific textbooks.
So we pulled over, we stretched the device out, I calibrated it, and all of a sudden, boom, there it was. It showed that time had slowed down by 20 microseconds. Nobody's ever gotten an anomalous reading with this thing or any of these things. Bob Lazar said he had an engine that was slightly larger than a basketball, and it was distorting gravity and space-time.
All that and much more. So stay tuned. The Black Vault Radio is about to begin. More than 20 years ago, I began a journey. My quest for the truth. My name is John Greenwald, and I have hammered the United States government with Freedom of Information Act requests trying to get answers. I have more than 2 million pages of declassified documents for you to download at theblackvault.com. Now, I attempt to dive even deeper and talk to some of the most brilliant minds on this planet. No government secret is off limits, and no question is off the table. All I aim for is the truth. This is the Black Vault Radio. That's right, everybody. This is another episode of the Black Vault Radio. Thank you so much for your letters, your support, and your online reviews. We're just only a couple shows in, and I have worked hard to get it on the show on iTunes and Google Play Store and Stitcher and TuneIn. I think that's enough. I don't know how many podcast places need to distribute this. I'm sure between one of those you can find something to subscribe to. So if you haven't, definitely check out theblackvault.com/show notes. That gives you the notes of everything I talk about on every single episode, including links to all of those subscription places. So if you want to subscribe to this, definitely log on and click on your icon of choice. It'll give you directions to do so. Now, that being said, I wanted to say thank you to all of those 5-star reviews that are already popping up on iTunes and a couple of other those places I just mentioned. Thank you for that, because that shows me I must be doing something right to at least a few of you that are enjoying the show, logging on, putting your reviews. Trust me, that is something that I can't thank you enough for, and something that is very, very helpful as I progress this show, grow, and bring more guests on. So the more ratings that appear, the better. So if you haven't done so yet, if you're a subscriber on iTunes or wherever you are, make sure you rate this podcast, if you want to call it that. Again, I'm apprehensive of some of these standard industry terms just because I'm trying to do something a little bit different with the format and how I bring it to you. But that being said, definitely log on. Please give me a review. I won't tell you to do 5 stars, but I'm trying very hard to earn those 5 stars when you place those reviews. So thank you for all of that. Now, that being said, I'm pretty excited about today's show, and the reason is the first episode, I had talked about a story in the TBV News segment about a time warp story in the deserts of Nevada. Now, I teased then, and I was still working on setting it up, but actually bringing Mr. Joshua P. Warren onto the show where he can talk about what he discovered. It's one thing to read it in the media or see the 90-second news piece and some short clips from Joshua, but why not do a whole show about it? Well, I'm happy to say that Joshua and I have spoken, and he is ready to come on to the Black Vault Radio and tell us all about that story and much, much more. And let me tell you, after spending an evening talking with this guy, he knows his stuff. He knows what he's talking about, and it's interesting. I'm going to be honest with you all, and I know Joshua will know this about me also. I'm very skeptical about those types of advancements in science because I'm curious to ask Joshua coming up in the interview, could this have been a machine malfunction? Did you really register time slow down? and because I am skeptical. But in the same breath, I want to say that we learn stuff all the time about science that we didn't know yesterday. And for decades and sometimes a lot longer, we will really feel like we know something or understand it. And all of a sudden we wake up the next day and the scientific world turns upside down because of some discovery, some new advancement that takes place. And who knows, maybe Joshua's onto something, but he's here to talk about it. I'll ask those questions. I'll let you guys decide. Now, before we get going onto the news segment, I want to talk about something that's unfolding as we speak. It's kind of to help document it for me and speak out loud a little bit, but I also want you guys to know what is going on in my world in the Black Vault. Now, as you know, I have filed over 8,500 requests since I started this. And back in 2004, one of them was a request for all documents on MK Ultra. Now, MK Ultra, for those who don't know, is the CIA program that really researched mind control and behavioral modification. Now, since I started the Black Vault, over the years, I've implemented different statistics software and scripts to monitor where people go. And don't worry, I'm not tracking you or anything like that. It just allows me to tally what is most interesting to people. So again, I don't track anything that's personally identifying or anything like that. But again, I can see what pages are most popular. And out of everything that I have put online, now for quite a few years, that number one spot belongs to the MK Ultra collection. Now, I received over 20,000 pages back in 2004, along with an index of what was on those CD-ROMs. And there it has existed since 2004 on the Black Vault, and pretty much since then has risen to be the top page. And again, that is number one, the top page in popularity. Now, why do I bring this up? Well, a researcher out there, his nickname is Oscar Diggs. I don't know if that's his real name, but I'm only bringing that up simply because that part is public, so anybody can see that nickname. So Oscar Diggs wrote me, and he went through meticulously, line by line, by that index that the CIA gave me on the MK Ultra collection. Now, I wrongfully assumed that the CIA was being honest and said everything that's on the CD is indexed on these documents. Well, I never had the time to go through one by one. And this guy did. He went through line by line, compiled a list of all of the missing documents, and there's quite a few of them. Now, to summarize this story, he wrote me and said, look, this is what I did. I kind of double-checked some of them, and sure enough, they're not there. Great job on him, by the way, because I want to compliment him for doing that. So I filed a FOIA request to the CIA for those specific missing document numbers stating, hey, you guys never sent me this. This was 2 years ago, if you can believe it. I have gone back and forth with the CIA multiple times, and I then had to kind of triple check the work of this other great researcher who did the legwork. I'm not taking credit for it. All I had to do was the CIA literally demanded that I give them the proof that those documents were not on the CD-ROMs. I sent them a 97-page fax. I did call them beforehand and say, hey, do you guys want a 97-pager? And they gave me permission to send it, so I sent it. It was irrefutable that the majority of these documents were missing. Now, there were a few that I did find going through line by line, so that's great. But there was still a huge number of documents that were missing. I was told by the CIA they would be given to me for free, simply because I had purchased the collection, and that index was indicative of what was on these CD-ROMs. Well, guess what? After going back months, back and forth 4 months, and the CIA kept fighting me, saying, well, you know, you got to prove that they're not there, and then we'll send them to you. After that 97-page fax, they sent me a letter. This came just a couple weeks ago. And they said, well, we made a mistake. Those documents are not supposed to all be on the CD-ROM. We just gave you that index, but your request was on MK Ultra, and some of these were on behavioral modification. So therefore, we consider them different, and therefore we do not consider them part of your request, and therefore you have to pay $425.80. Now, why am I bringing this up to you? Because this is kind of unfolding now. Well, I may need your help. And the reason I may need your help is I'm going to crowdfund that $425+. However, I just wrote today, the recording of this interview and the posting of this show, a multiple-page detailed appeal, a detailed request for a fee waiver, to put it in an official way, because you need that under the Freedom of Information Act. If they deny it, I will appeal it. If I lose, I need your help. I can't afford to pay all these document estimations throughout all the agencies. So the last time I did this was about a year and a half ago, and was able to get the FBI to declassify a lot of their internal newsletters called The Investigator. Well, I need your help again, probably here in the near future, and I wanted to tell you the ridiculousness of what the CIA is doing. And they were telling me things on the phone that actually were not true. And if you can get this, they're the only agency that I know of that when they call you from the Freedom of Information Act office, they won't even tell you who's calling, meaning they won't give you their first name. Now, I'm sorry, but how silly is that? So when I returned calls, I'm like, I don't know who called me. And they said, well, we'll pass it on to your case manager and they'll reach out to you when they can. And I said, well, can I just get forwarded over to them? Because, if I'm out of the office or if I'm on the phone or whatever and I can't switch over, the whole process starts again. And they will not give you their name. It's like you're calling some kind of secret, top secret operation in Budapest. And all of those guys are not supposed to be there, so they won't tell you their name. No, this is the Freedom of Information Act office. I have a lot of respect for all of those guys and gals that work in those offices throughout every government agency, the CIA included. But that is just a little bit overkill and creates such a problem. But I was able to prove that this person was not telling me the truth on the phone, that they were telling me I could not do certain things that are rights afforded to me under the Freedom of Information Act and a specific CIA regulation. So I'm going to fight it. I'm going to fight that $425 plus charge, see where I can end up here in the end. But just be prepared. You may hear about this story again in a future episode, and that crowdfunding campaign may be underway. But just know that the CIA has literally over 4,000 pages of documents that have not seen the light of day, I believe. Have not seen the light of day, so I am trying to get those. I'll close up the story with this. I asked the gentleman on the phone today, can you at least tell me if the documents are online in what is called their CREST database? If you're not familiar with CREST, CIA has pretty much compiled all of their millions of pages of declassified documents in this gigantic database, and it has finally gone online. Now, I'm kind of under the impression that everything that they've declassified, at least the majority of it, should be in there. Now, I won't hold them to that because, there's probably not 100%. But I asked him specifically, can you tell me, sir, if I'm going to spend $425 plus on this, can you tell me if the documents are in the CREST database? Because, number one, I don't want to waste your time making over 4,000 photocopies. But, number two, I don't want to waste my money if I could just go on and download them. Now, I can't find them. And I told him that. I said, I can't find them anywhere, but maybe I'm just not searching in the right area. And very sternly, he says, well, I didn't work on CREST, so I can't answer that for you. So if you want these documents, you're going to have to pay $425 plus for them. And that was it. So I got off the phone, and so I immediately wrote that request for a full fee waiver. And if they do deny that, I do have a right to appeal it, unlike what he told me, and we'll see where we end up. Anyway, thanks for listening to that story, so be prepared for some updates coming up here in the next few weeks. That being said, before we get to Mr. Joshua P. Warren, my guest on this episode of the Black Vault Radio, let's get to some headlines on TBV News. In this episode's TBV News segment, there are a few stories I want to go over with you before we welcome Joshua P. Warren to the show. Now, as you know, the first couple episodes dealt with the Roswell incident in very different ways. First, we talked with Stanton Friedman and really got an inside look to Stanton as a person. Then we talked to Frank Kimbler, who's really nailing the science behind what he's doing out there. And ultimately, the government's kind of chasing after him to kind of give up the samples for inspection. And we heard about his run-in with the Bureau of Land Management on the last episode. If you missed those, definitely tune in because those are stories you don't often hear when it comes to the Roswell incident. Now, as I've said a couple times now on this show, Roswell is not something that I like to spend a whole lot of time on. However, I believe that it is definitely worth a mention, as this last weekend was the anniversary. Last week we spoke with Frank Kimbler, who appeared in the Roswell City event, where they every year around the anniversary of the Roswell incident hold big festivities. The Roswell Museum is obviously open to the public and really draws a gigantic crowd. This will probably be the last time, for a while anyway, that I mention the R word, but I do believe that it is worth a mention in this episode's TBV News segment, because at that event this last weekend, some additional information came out, or at least it was definitely profiled more than I've seen it profiled before, about a mandible, a casting of a mandible, allegedly from one of the Roswell aliens that crashed in 1947. Now, Tom Carey and Don Schmitt are two names that are often associated with being experts on the Roswell incident. They've written multiple books and often appear in Roswell at these events. And this year, they really kind of unveiled a little bit more information about how they came across this mandible. Now, allegedly, there was a dental technician by the name of John Mosgrove, and in 1979, October to be exact, he was working at the Veterans Administration Hospital lab, and he was ordered by his boss to make a casting of some teeth that he was given with a pretty strict deadline of the next morning. Now, he made that casting, turned over the original impression with the casting that he made, and he saw his boss trash the original impression that he made the casting out of, and then turn over the casting to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base officers. Now, for those that don't know the full story behind Roswell, allegedly those bodies were flown to Roswell, from Roswell to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and it was Wright Field at the time. And there they have either remained or remained for some time, or maybe they got moved somewhere else, doesn't matter. But allegedly this was all part of that incident, and this dental technician went into the trash, got that casting, felt that this was something big, and made a couple more castings out of that impression and locked them away in a box. Now, apparently he talked to an NBC TV reporter in 1995, showed the casting, but kind of locked it back up immediately after, and there it is sat for quite a few years until Tom Carey and Don Schmitt came along, were able to reveal the story. Well, at the museum now, and I'm going to link this in the show notes, but at the museum now, they actually have a casting of a human mandible right next to this alleged alien mandible. And this isn't really something that I've heard that often before, so I thought it was definitely worth a mention, because I feel that this is probably one of the first times that John Mosgrove, other than that NBC News interview that he did, and what I can't determine is if it actually aired at all. That is one I'm not sure of. However, I know that he hasn't talked often. He was supposed to phone in during the talk that Tom Carey and Don Schmitt were going to give. Sadly, from what I understand, there was a family emergency, so Mr. Mosgrove could not take part in that event, and therefore could not offer his phone-in interview on stage while Don Schmitt and Tom Carey were speaking at the Roswell event. That being said, though, definitely check out that link. It is something interesting, you know. I mean, it's definitely on the newer side of evidence. That obviously sends up my red flags a little bit, because Roswell happened in 47. So when anything somewhat new comes out, I am always a little bit apprehensive about it. But the story seems pretty solid, and I know that Don Schmitt and Tom Carey have put a lot of time into all of this. So it's at least worth a mention. And there thus ends probably my mention of Roswell, at least for a little while here on the Black Vault Radio. But I felt it only fitting, since this last weekend was the anniversary, to at least bring that part to you. On the space front, NASA announced a very interesting story. Now, this is a highly scientific and technical one, but apparently they were able to source a neutrino that they discovered late in 2017 to a massive black hole. They called it a monster black hole. Now, let me read you what the definition of a neutrino is. Excuse me. A neutrino is a fermion, an elementary particle with half-integer spin that interacts only via the weak subatomic force and gravity. The mass of the neutrino is much smaller than that of other known elementary particles. Although only differences of squares of the three mass values are known as of 2016, cosmological observations imply that the sum of the three masses must be less than 1/millionth that of the electron. In other words, these neutrinos are pretty darn small. And they found this thing, detected it in the South Pole in late 2017, September 22nd to be exact. And they detected this thing, and now they have traced it back to this monster black hole. Now, why am I telling you this? Because I'm telling you, I don't understand it. I've read it 1,000 times trying to figure it out. The only thing that stuck out to me was the size of this thing, and that to me is pretty darn small. I want to give a quick plug to a comment that I'm about to read, but the plug is to OnStellar. The OnStellar community, if you're not familiar with it, I'm one of the contributors. They asked me about 6 months ago to take part in this new social network. I was a little bit apprehensive at first, but man, they've done a great job making a social network an alternative for the Facebooks and the Twitters and all the social networks that you can think of, an alternative specifically for more of the paranormal and the fringe topics that we all talk about and love to talk about, but sometimes may be afraid to talk about on those open channels in Facebook. Well, OnStellar, that's www.onstellar.com, has done a great job that allows you to go on there, register for an account, very similar to social networkings where you can see articles, post articles, respond, comment, post pictures, have your own wall. So there's similarities to what's out there. But again, this is very much specifically focused to our specific niche of all things fringe and fun. So a shout out to them because I wrote about this story from NASA on there. And one comment sticks out more than any other. And it comes from, and I'm probably not going to pronounce this right because the community is comprised of people all over the globe. But this particular user has the name of Sita Shakti. And she says, fascinating. Even more so that we have the ability to detect a single neutrino flying into Earth from 3.7 billion miles away. But we can't detect a single UFO and admit it. That's a brilliantly said comment, Siddha Shakti. So good on you for posting that. I had to read that out loud because, yeah, this article is totally over my head. But it really does make you think that they can detect something so darn small that hit Earth and the South Pole, and then they were able to essentially reverse dissect the path and figure out that it came from this monster black hole, and yet they can't admit to detecting unexplained aerial phenomena on the planet Earth flying in the skies. Great point. Had to point it out. If you like all that science geeky stuff, again, in the show notes, it is a very interesting story, and it really does show how amazing these scientists really are. I'll poke fun with some jokes about UFOs and this and that, but hey, joking aside, these guys and girls involved in these scientific pursuits of the truth, whether it comes to the cosmos or anything else that they may be researching, my kudos to them because they do amazing work, and this is a prime example of just that. Now, the last story I want to deal with, this specific one comes with news this week about President Donald Trump's Supreme Court pick and nominee. As we all know, he chose Brett Kavanaugh for the Supreme Court. And the reason why I am bringing this up is this is posted by the National Security Archive. This is another kind of plug that I want to throw out there because the National Security Archive is an amazing archive. It's hard for me to say that about a lot of sites, but this is definitely one. And they have focused very, very hard on archiving thousands and thousands of declassified documents, which very much goes to the heart of what I do. And so I really do want to kind of tip my hat to them. If you're not familiar on how to get there, I want to point you to their blog because I want to tell you about an article that was posted today on July 12th. If you go to unredacted.com, again, unredacted.com, that is their blog. And Lauren Harper was the author, and she actually brought up a ruling under the Freedom of Information Act that was partially ruled on by Judge Kavanaugh. And let me read you just this one part. Well, first, before I read it, let me give you a preface. So the National Security Archive goes after these, formerly classified or presently classified documents and essentially tries to get them declassified. And when they do, they post them. And again, that is why it's kind of dear to my heart, and I really do appreciate what they do. And they went after a document, a volume about the Bay of Pigs operation. And this was a CIA document. It was called Volume 5 is what they were going after. And the CIA withheld it. So it went all the way to the Court of Appeals, and they made their case in front of 3 judges. And in a 2-1 ruling, and Kavanaugh was the one that that was on the side of secrecy, and that is the side that won in this particular case, at least initially. Now let me read you the quote. Kavanaugh, in a 2-1 ruling, agreed with the CIA and DOJ lawyers that the document was a, quote, draft, unquote, and its release would expose an agency's decision-making process in such a way as to discourage candid discussion within the agency and thereby undermine the agency's ability to perform its functions. Archive Director Tom Blanton said at the time, quote, presidents only get 12 years after they leave office to withhold their deliberations, and the Federal Reserve Board releases its verbatim transcripts after 5 years. But here, the D.C. Circuit has given the CIA's historical office immortality for its drafts, because as the CIA argues, those drafts might confuse the public. Now, it goes on. They've got great sources in here, a lot more information. I'll link it in the show notes. But I want to give my definite compliments to Lauren Harper and the National Security Archive, because I don't want to make this political. And it's going to sound a little bit political, but it's really not. But I bring it up because judges who really do rule on the side of secrecy scare me. And even though I do believe secrets should be kept, and there are secrets that should be kept, Stanton Friedman and I talked about that in better detail, but there are some secrets that should be kept. But when you start talking about historical narratives and things that happened decades and decades ago, something like the Bay of Pigs invasion is not necessarily going to be a severe threat to national security if it comes out. That is our history. That's what makes us who we are. That is something that our government did. We should know about it. And again, although some of those secrets should be kept, I don't believe that is just an agency-wide ruling that should always take effect on something that might embarrass an agency, make them look bad, make America look bad. Because again, that is our history. We need to learn from it and move on. The time of Adolf Hitler is not something we want to just suppress. Why? Well, because history tends to repeat itself unless you learn from it. Continue to talk about it. Embrace the history, and it won't repeat itself. Now, eventually that document was released. The Freedom of Information Act was amended years later that allowed FOIA requesters like all of us, part of the National Security Archive, myself, and even you listening if you decided to use the FOIA. It disallowed the agency to withhold information under the exemption of what they call B5, and that is that deliberative process. Anything older than 25 years cannot have that exemption on it. They can't withhold it. They can't classify it. I don't know how many loopholes they can jump through to withhold that information, but the FOIA was rewritten to allow us the right to request that information that's 25 plus years old, and disallows agencies to just say, hey, it's a draft document, so we don't want to confuse the public and allow this out into the public domain, which is what the CIA argued. So again, hats tip to the National Security Archive for not only writing that blog today, they call that a hashtag TBT pick, their Throwback Thursday. I think they do that every Thursday. But definitely getting that document, and hats tipped for that as well, because I really do appreciate when victories like that come to pass. I think that it should definitely be recognized. That being said, those are the headlines I want to talk about. Have fun looking at them in the show notes. If you don't know how to get to those, www.theblackvault.com/show notes. I will link all of those articles that I talked about. But let me not waste any more time. let me get to this episode's guest, Mr. Joshua P. Warren, in the TBV Dialogue segment. On this episode's TBV Dialogue segment, we're talking about space-time warps and Area 51 technology. Now, my guest, Joshua P. Warren, is an investigator who pioneers the relationship between the mind, energy, matter, and strange phenomena. He owns the Asheville Mystery Museum and Laboratory in North Carolina and the Bermuda Triangle Research Base in Puerto Rico. He's authored more than 20 best-selling books, including Use the Force, A Jedi's Guide to the Law of Attraction, and The Wishing Machine Workbook. He has appeared on numerous TV programs on History Channel, Discovery, National Geographic, Animal Planet, Sci-Fi, TLC, and even starred on his own series on the Travel Channel called Paranormal Paparazzi. He travels the world investigating mysterious phenomena, and he even made the cover of a science journal in 2004 for lab experiments regarding energy fields in nature related to the Brown Mountain Lights. This October, he's producing a wishing machine radionics workshop in Los Angeles. You can visit him online at www.joshuapwarren.com. Joshua, thank you so much for joining me on the Black Vault Radio.
Hey, thank you, John. It's a great pleasure to be with you.
Well, I'm excited to talk to you. I had referenced your story, which we're going to get into this episode, but I had talked about your recent discovery in the Nevada desert of a possible indication that time is slowing down, and said in that episode that I was going to work hard to try and get you on, and I'm glad you agreed. For those that are listening, Joshua and I met when I appeared at the Coast to Coast AM live event in Las Vegas. And Joshua came up and introduced himself. I had heard about his work in the past, but it was really good to meet him in person and really kind of get a handle for exactly what he's doing. So Joshua, thank you for spending the time with me this week on the Black Vault Radio. And let me just kind of jump in with you giving a better introduction than I did. Can you tell everybody a little bit about your background and what is your interest? It sounds like all things paranormal, but do you have a specific focus in mind?
Yeah, well, it's funny because I started out investigating ghosts. I was born and raised in Asheville, North Carolina, which is the heart of the Blue Ridge Mountains, the oldest mountains in North America. And so my family has been on both sides in that area for hundreds of years. So I grew up hearing all of these interesting pioneer stories and Native American legends and all the spooky stuff that you experience around a campfire at night. And I became very interested at a young age in whether or not this stuff had some validity. And so I started writing and publishing some of these spooky stories when I was just a teenager. And in fact, I mentioned it's kind of interesting that both you and I got started really early in our chosen fields. I was 15 when I was working for the local newspaper. I was publishing books when I was a teenager. And what I found over time is that, even though I went to college and studied journalism and mass communications and that sort of thing, is that when you go out and you're trying to document the validity of some of these extraordinary things, you need to have a decent grasp of the scientific method so you can really take a more objective look at what may or may not be happening. And so that's how I became involved with a NASA scientist named Charles Yost, who had a laboratory in western North Carolina, and I worked with him on a lot of projects regarding how energy manifests. And what I found is that even though I started with ghosts, I'm fond of that quote by Charles Fort, that you can measure a circle beginning anywhere, because the longer I stuck with it, eventually I started seeing ghosts connecting to what people would report as UFO encounters, and then those would connect to cryptids, and then all that would sort of connect to psychic phenomena people would report. And what you realize is that if you're serious about this stuff and you stick with it long enough, eventually, no matter how you enter this field, you will become exposed to different facets of it. And so that's why now, after all these years, I guess about 20, almost 27 years of doing this stuff, I have really studied all of these different angles. And so I hope that I can sort of maybe lend a bit of diversity to how we view these very strange things and how they may interrelate.
Now, before we get to your world travels, because I know you travel all around the world doing your research and kind of spreading the word, also doing lectures yourself, was there one specific case or experience that you had that really drilled home to you, hey, I got to do this and I really have to get answers? Was there something specific?
Yes, there were really intriguing things that happened to my family before I was even born that I knew were factual. I mean, I had a great uncle who pretty much just vanished in mid-conversation one day and was never seen or heard from again. That was a great mystery in our family. But as far as
Wait, hold on. Before you move on from that, so he literally disappeared physically, and you never saw him again.
Well, this was before I was born. This happened in 1936, I believe, and his name was Claude Calloway.
Okay.
He was in his late 20s, and he lived with my mother's side of the family out in the countryside of Barnardsville, North Carolina. And there were a lot of kids. And the story gets really creepy, though, John, because one day Claude and his father, a man named Jack, they came back from a small game hunting trip up in the mountains. And my grandmother, Virginia, was about 13 years old at the time, and she asked them to pose for a photograph. And so, because she'd just gotten a picture for her birthday, it was kind of a novel thing for a kid to have at that time. And she took a picture of these two rugged old mountain men, standing there holding their rabbits and squirrels. And when the picture developed, Claude, her older brother, did not have a head. And I saw this picture when I was a little kid, and I'm telling you, you can see the vegetation behind the head. It wasn't like, he was moving the head. It wasn't blurry. They knew that was weird, but they didn't understand enough about photography to realize just how weird it was. So now we fast forward 1 month later. This is in July. Claude was sitting on the porch reading a copy of his favorite periodical called Western Magazine, old Gunslinger Tales. And as he was sitting there on the porch reading this, Jack, the father, was in the kitchen fixing lunch for the two of them, and they were conversing through an open window. And at one point, Jack said something to Claude, and Claude didn't answer. And so Jack walked out onto the porch. Here's the copy of Western Magazine, but no Claude. And, of course, Claude was anticipating this food coming out any minute. And so minutes turned to hours. Various family members started coming home, and Jack saying, what the heck happened to Claude? Who is seeing Claude? Nobody had any idea. The next day, people were out in the woods. They were looking for him. In the ensuing days, authorities were involved. And my great-uncle, Claude Calloway, literally disappeared in mid-conversation that day, and never was seen or heard from again. And that was a big, big tragedy in my family because they never had resolution. And they, and I, of course, became an adult, and I went there and I interviewed all the elderly people in the community about their version of events. They all told me the same thing. I hired a forensic historian named Vance Pollock who followed Claude's paper trail, his employment records, census records, all that kind of stuff. And it all ended that day. And knowing that actually happened and seeing how that impacted my family, and furthermore, knowing that 1 month before, this photograph had been taken of him that developed showing him without a head, made me understand at an early age the reality of these things. That
wow.
What we often consider the mysterious or the paranormal, this is not just something you read about in a fictional book, but it's these are real things that happen and affect people's lives.
Now, this photograph, can they download it on your website? Can people see it on your website? Have you chosen not to post it?
Well, this is what's very frustrating to me. I saw the picture on a number of occasions when I was a kid.
Okay.
And then my grandmother died, and she had 10 children. And within 48 hours, all these kids had come in and picked that house apart, and nobody knows what happened to this photograph. So I'm hoping that it didn't end up getting trashed. I hope that somebody out there still has it, because, we all got to see it. But it's one of those, again, frustrating things that, I don't actually have the photo in hand.
Gotcha.
But as I got older, of course, then I went out and started doing my own investigations and having my own experiences. And I think that the most profound one occurred to me when I was in my early 20s. I probably spent a good 6 years visiting haunted places without ever seeing a ghost. And that surprised everybody because I was known, as the ghost expert because I had written all these stories about ghosts, but I'd never seen one.
Mm-hmm.
And I got to the point, John, where honestly I thought maybe some people can see these things and some people can't, and I'm just one of those people who can't because, I don't have the proper rods and cones or whatever it is that, and but that all changed. I finally got a call from a young lady who had moved into a house, an old house. She called 911 the first day she moved in because she thought an intruder had broken into the house because she saw this figure of a man running around. And, of course, the cops came, and there was no evidence that anybody had been there. And that was just the preview of what was to come. So she quickly realized this house was haunted, and often she would see this sort of misty form floating around inside the house. And she got just phenomenal pictures of this thing. Now, these are pictures you can see on my website. When things took a really strange turn was when she started waking up in the middle of the night and this misty form was in the bedroom with her. And then one night she woke up and it was in the bed with her, and that's when she was like, okay, the heck with this. And she left the house in the middle of the night, slept in her car, called me and said, look, I'm moving out of this house unless there's some way to help me. And I told her, look, I'm not a ghostbuster, I'm not an exorcist, but I'm happy to come and, take a look. And so the first time I went to her house, I didn't really experience anything unusual, but I was really impressed by her photographs showing these bizarre, again, misty, streaky, smoky forms all over the place. So I went back a second time, and on that second occasion, I was going through the house, taking measurements, and I just so happened to be in the attic with another researcher named Rob. Mm-hmm. And at one point, Rob said, Josh, look. And I turned, and he and I were about 3 feet apart, and right there between us was this blue-gray, misty form just swirling in the air. And we were both mesmerized, of course, by what we were seeing. And I actually reached out and touched it. So did Rob. It felt absolutely icy cold in the middle, made the hair on my knuckles stand up like an electrostatic charge. And after about 30 seconds, it started to dim. And at that point, I realized, oh, man, I have a camera around my neck. And so I took a photograph of it just before it completely dissolved. And that photograph is also on my website. And I came downstairs and I told her, well, I saw it. And she was just ecstatic because this was some validation that, there was something there that was, that she wasn't crazy. And I told her, look, I don't know if this is the spirit of a dead person or what this is, but I can understand. You see this misty thing floating around in the attic of your old house. I mean, you would call this a ghost. And so this, for me, became a life-altering experience, and I became absolutely fascinated with understanding the relationship between the non-physical and the physical and how these things manifest. And what I found is that over time, that question is just as integral to ghosts as it is to UFOs, mm-hmm. because people talk about these technologies that seem to defy the limitations of physics and the laws that we are aware of. And so therefore we have to ask ourselves, what is happening when we take something that we consider an energetic form and see it transform into something that's tangible and that you can interact and interface with. And so, obviously I'm sure that'll be more the focus of our conversation, but as you can tell, to me, it's not a very big leap to take mm-hmm. from one type of manifestation to another, because it's all about understanding the limitations of reality.
Really fascinating story. For those listening, I'm going to be offering direct links to those photographs on the show notes. If you don't know how to get there, go to www.theblackvault.com/show show notes. Look for episode number 3 with Joshua P. Warren, but you can also check him out on his website, www.joshuapwarren.com. Now, Joshua, you travel the world. I know that it's not all about ghosts. Most recently, you went to Puerto Rico. Can you tell everybody why you went down there?
Yeah, well, I've been traveling to Puerto Rico for 13 or 14 years, and I've spent most of the past 5 years there operating the Bermuda Triangle Research Center. And what I found fascinating about Puerto Rico long ago is that, it's not a very big island, really. It's 100 miles by 35 miles. And yet you find more strange phenomena per square foot there than just about anywhere else I've been. Of course, when it comes to UFOs, you've got the Arecibo Observatory there, which up until recently was the largest radio satellite dish on Earth, featured in the movie Contact with Jodie Foster. A lot of UFO and USO activity around there. And by the way, Arecibo is also an outpost of the HARP project. So there's an ionospheric research center there as well, which ties into a lot of interesting conspiracies. As far as ghost stories are concerned, well, Old San Juan is the oldest city within U.S. territory there, so you have all kinds of interesting, creepy stories and catacombs and pirate tales. As far as cryptids are concerned, it's actually the birthplace of the so-called chupacabra, and a lot of people unfortunately think of the chupacabra as some kind of mangy coyote that they feature in the news once in a while running around Texas or Arizona, but actually that's not it at all. The original chupacabra reports described a creature much more like an alien. I mean, sort of a bipedal, hunched over creature with big black eyes, spines running down its back. Often it could even fly. I could tell you all kinds of crazy chupacabra stories. And then as far as, psychic phenomena, you have all kinds of chapels where people report miracles, and there are a number of different kinds of monsters and creatures, and a lot of natural wonders there. I mean, in the entire world, I believe there are only about 7 bioluminescent bays that function all year round, and 4 of them are there in Puerto Rico. So, and then of course, to beat all, it's one of the 3 points of the Bermuda Triangle, and it's actually sort of right out there in the middle of the Bermuda Triangle. And so it seemed to me like a very valuable place to go in order to sort of understand, like, what is, if anything, the common denominator between all of these odd phenomena that people sort of classify based upon the particular window that person gets into the activity.
Did you find what you were looking for down there?
I certainly came much, much closer. Well, for one thing, and this actually does tie into some of the stuff we'll discuss with the space-time warp, I found right off the bat it intriguing that if you just jump onto Google and you do a search for NASA gravity maps, you'll see these images of Earth that come up that show the Earth color-coded. And these colors represent the strength of Earth's gravitational field at any given place. And you'll find that it's very inconsistent. Some places it's weak, some places it's strong. Weak places are color-coded blue, strong places red or yellowish. And in fact, because we have these inconsistencies, a clock in your attic will literally run faster than a clock in your basement, because a clock in your basement is closer to the Earth's gravitational field, and gravity slows time. So anyway, that said, when you look at this gravity map, you'll see that whole patch of Earth that we call the Bermuda Triangle is not only blue, but the bluest of the blue is right over the island of Puerto Rico, where it's so blue that you can't even actually see the island on the map. And I started looking at places that had weak gravity and comparing them to places that have strong gravity. And if you look at the places with stronger gravity, well, you find pyramids and churches and temples and sacred sites. And I began to wonder if maybe there's a relationship between gravity and paranormal and strange phenomena. And that if that's the case, you have crazy guys like me who run out and want to see a ghost or something spooky. But in the past, people didn't feel that way. People wanted to avoid that kind of stuff. They thought it was evil and it was terrifying. And so it would make sense that places that had weaker gravity, that would allow more of this stuff to sort of materialize, if you will, would be feared places that would become infamous.
Hmm.
On the other hand, places where that kind of stuff naturally didn't seem to occur would have lent itself to building some kind of a protective or sacred area. And so I found, for one thing, that there's a really interesting field that needs great exploration and study, the field of the connection between gravity and all of these unusual phenomena, and it certainly includes UFOs, especially since that with UFOs, we don't know if these are always some kind of a machine that's coming here from another rock,
Hmm.
or if these are some kind of technology that are literally slipping into this dimension from some other dimension.
Hmm.
And it's hard for us to even comprehend that, but mathematically, it's supposedly possible that there are other realms where other life can exist, and so it may be that gravity it plays a key role in determining the extent to which we can experience these other realms and these other technologies.
Interesting. One other thing, you mentioned UFOs in Puerto Rico, arguably one of the most fascinating UFO videos that has come out in the last 5-10 years or so would be the Agua Dia video. And my connection with that is someone anonymously wrote me. I don't like anonymous letters, let me just say that. I mean, for those who know me and see me lecture and stuff, I generally don't deal with anonymous or whistleblowers or whatever. But they sent me a high definition version of that Agua Dia UFO. Now, I'm not trying to pat myself on the back, but as far as I know, that was the first time that a high definition video of the Agua Dia footage ever went online. And I posted it with a disclaimer. I don't know, 100% who the source was, but it did coincide with the footage that was out there already, just a heck of a lot more clear. And so I was fascinated by that case, and I know some people have kind of investigated it a bit, but I believe you did too in the last couple of years, right? You went down there and investigated the Agua Dia sighting?
Yeah, I was actually there in Puerto Rico when the footage was captured. And in fact, for those who are maybe roughly familiar with the geography of the island, most people who've been to Puerto Rico have only been to the area around San Juan, which
Hmm.
of course is the major city. I actually was on the opposite side of the island. So my base is in Boquerón, which is in Cabo Rojo. So basically, if you look at Puerto Rico, it's kind of shaped like your hand if you hold it out in front of yourself horizontally. And San Juan is near the northeastern corner, and Boquerón and Cabo Rojo is on the southwestern corner.
Okay.
Well, right up the west coast, about 45 minutes from Boquerón, you have Agua Dia, which is on the northwestern point. So I was only about 45 minutes away when this happened. And so, of course, yes, Puerto Rico has millions of people, but it's still an island, and everybody kind of knows everybody else in one way or another, and rumors and news spreads really quickly. And I, was already a focal point for UFO reports at that time. I mean, I really stood out when I was in Puerto Rico because, I was in an area where you don't see a lot of tourists.
Hmm.
And so everybody kind of knew if something weird happens, let this guy know. And I have a lot of great friends there, and the people were just so wonderful, practically family to me there. And so when that footage was captured, immediately, I mean, the day it was captured, I was contacted by a friend whose brother works at the Homeland Security office there in Agua Dia.
Hmm.
And so his brother had called him and told him immediately what had happened. It happened the night before. And then he contacted me and said, "You've got to see this." And I mean, everybody knew what had happened. Everybody was talking about the details. And he told me to show up the next day, and he was going to have the footage for me. And I showed up, and he said that his brother couldn't get the footage, but he was going to keep trying, and obviously it would be illegal, frankly, for him to pass that footage along. And I also was a little cautious because I didn't want to get it wrapped up in any type of problem where I'm trying to to look at some kind of classified footage. I mean, I'm not in the mood to go to jail over this stuff, right? And so but it was well known that the footage existed. And then, of course, I realized that it would just be a matter of time until somebody leaked it. And so I don't know who leaked it, and I'm glad I don't, because I'm sure it's still a legal issue to this day. But once I saw the footage, I mean, everybody said, yeah, that's the footage. I mean, there was no question. And of course, one of the most amazing things about the footage, for those who have never seen it, is that you're looking at this object that's being filmed with a thermal camera, which is fantastic because it gives you even more data about what's being shot. And this object is very irregular and weird looking. It's zooming up to 120 miles per hour around the airport there. Now, this is a commercial airport with civilian flights, so they had to ground all the flights. This thing is zipping around with absolutely no care whatsoever regarding threatening motions or anything related to our meager security precautions. And as the camera follows this thing, it dips into the water. And because this is a thermal camera, then you can still see the object below the surface of the water, continuing to travel about 95 miles per hour, just inches below the surface of the water. And then when it emerges from the water, now it's joined by a second object. And so now these two objects are sort of dipping in and out of the water, and then they finally both go back into the water and disappear. And this just so happens to be not too far from the Puerto Rico Trench, which is the deepest point in the Atlantic Ocean, the second deepest point in the world. It's almost 30,000 feet deep. So you could take Mount Everest and sit it down in this trench, and just a little tip would be sticking up. And so that's quite interesting that they disappeared down by where that trench was. But what is so, astounding about all this is that, there is a group of scientists that analyzed this in such enormous detail. They produced a 162-page report. And released this thing freely as a PDF into the public domain, and all this is accessible through my website. And this is just one of many, many, many examples of this kind of thing that is seen on a regular basis around Puerto Rico. Again, UFOs and USOs. Whether you're talking to some old fisherman or you're talking to somebody who's a government authority, it's very well known. And, I could tie that into many other weird things regarding the triangle, but I find it intriguing that last year, when the Pentagon finally admitted that they'd been back engineering some UFO debris in the Las Vegas area, and they released some of that footage related to the USS Nimitz incident and all that, they still didn't acknowledge or even mention this footage from Aguadilla. And personally, I think it's because that might be scary for people, because you're talking about the vulnerability of the commercial airport there with civilians traveling. It's a little different when you're talking about some incident that happened over some type of aircraft carrier out in the middle of the ocean, versus something that clearly demonstrates it has the power to come right there into your most sensitive airspace, and there's nothing you can do about it.
Yeah, and I laugh at, because I don't know everything there is to know about Aguadilla, so I'm glad that you filled in a lot of the gaps and the details and so on. My only connection literally was posting that high-def video, but I didn't research it. You obviously have, but a lot of skeptics try and come out, and I know what your answer is going to be, but I'm going to ask you anyway, that they try and say, oh, well, look, that's either Mylar balloon or a bird or so on. Now, I'm sorry, you can kind of deduce with common sense that that's not the case. But how do you react to people that way that just try and dismiss Aguadilla as being that?
Well, yeah, I think that there's a big difference between simply looking at regular footage where you are prone to encounter optical illusions, where it's difficult to determine a lot of specific objective data because you don't know the scale of everything you're looking at, versus something that was shot with a thermal camera
Hmm.
by a government agency. I mean, when you are able to look at that, you can tell the temperature that it is. For one thing, it was most of the time, I believe, it was over 100 degrees, and this was 9:30 p.m. at night. Puerto Rico does not get that hot, by the way. A lot of
Hmm.
people would think it does, but Puerto Rico has a pretty consistent temperature range year round. That was one of the fun things about living there. It was always like a mild summer day. Now that I'm in Las Vegas, different story,
Hmm.
But I mean, I don't think I ever saw it over 100 degrees once in Puerto Rico. But anyway, so you've got the temperature, you have the speed at which it's moving, and which is extraordinary. There is no conventional propulsion system there. I mean, you don't have a rotor, there are no wings, there's no jet, there's nothing that would explain how it's moving like that. But the real mind boggler though is that when it clearly dips into the ocean and continues traveling under the surface and then emerges with this a second object. I mean, I think this is perhaps the best evidence that civilians have ever had access to because of the kind of camera that was used to shoot it. And sometimes, I've only had a couple people say to me they thought it was a balloon, and I was sort of astounded to hear that somebody could think that because the only way I can believe that somebody would say that's a balloon is if they haven't actually really sat down and looked at it and thought about what they're seeing.
Hmm.
There's just no way it's a balloon.
One way for me to contrast, I don't know if you agree or disagree with this, but when you look at that footage, the newest version of the Agua Dia footage that came out, it is very interesting about how clear and crisp the image is. And then you look at the To the Stars Academy releases from the Nimitz and so on. I'm not trying to take away from those videos because those are interesting as well, but they definitely lack the crispness of that Agua Dia footage. And so I'm kind of curious if maybe when the government finally lets go of some of this footage and releases things officially, do you think that we might get some crisper footage of the, again, the Nimitz encounter, the Tic Tac footage with your experience, or do you think that's as good as it gets?
Oh yeah, yeah, I'm sure. I mean, well, there are people running around every day capturing some pretty amazing footage
Hmm.
just with their own phones. The problem is trying to figure out what's real and what's not because you
Yeah.
have a lot of hoaxers out there. And so when I do analysis of imagery, I do everything possible to not just analyze the footage or the pictures at face value. I also want to talk to who shot the footage,
Hmm.
and I want, and you know what? 9 times out of 10, if something is fake, if you actually start pursuing it, the person who put it out there, well, they will not talk to you.
Yeah, they'll back
Um,
off. And
yeah, they'll back off very quickly, and so and I like to get as many details about like, okay, who are you? What was the situation? What time of day was it? What was the weather like? Why did you even shoot this? Blah blah blah, and get that kind of context. In addition to being able to analyze what you see, and also, does it even seem like a natural way of shooting this thing? Like most people, if they film something like a UFO, they're not expecting to see a UFO that day. It takes them off guard, and so they film it in a certain way. It's
hmm.
not framed beautifully, and so there are lots of steps that you can take. But I still, that said, have seen so many amazing, great images just from Puerto Rico, and in fact, images that you probably never even seen because I mean, this is stuff that there are people there who just send things to me. In fact, if you go to JoshuaPWarren.com and you, let's see, I believe if you go there and you click on Gallery of the Strange, I have so much stuff on my website. There's a section that says UFOs and USOs. That's got some weird stuff, but actually, probably the better thing is just to go and scroll down my homepage at joshuapwarren.com, and there are areas there. Oh yeah, there's one. There's a link on my homepage. Here it is. It says New Puerto Rico UFO Pics. Click here. And again, you just got to scroll down. It's a text link. These are pictures that you've probably never seen that were captured earlier this year. And I mean, we had a huge crowd of people in Boca Raton, Puerto Rico, who all saw this gigantic UFO. It was like something out of Close Encounters of the Third Kind. This thing appeared over the Boca Raton Bay, and this is one of many pictures that was taken of this thing. And yet, oddly enough, what I found is that because Puerto Rico is a Spanish-speaking island, I mean, that is their official language, Spanish. Mm-hmm. Yes, granted, a lot of people speak English, but because all their media is in Spanish, the United States media does not pay attention to 99% of what happens in Puerto Rico. And, I mean, in fact, this hurricane situation from last year, that gave that island more exposure than it's had in decades.
Yeah.
And a lot of people, frankly, John, they don't even know that Puerto Rico is a part of the United States. They think it's another country or something like that. So there's a lot of material there. There's great imagery that people have never seen from Puerto Rico.
Let me ask you one last thing about Puerto Rico before we move on to the time warp discovery that you made. It sounds like people down there are much more open to experiences like this. I mean, here in America and those involved in UFO research, it sounds like you're much more privy to a lot of the cases down there, but you only hear about a select few of them. Are the people down there much more open to this topic than we are here in America?
Well, I certainly think that they are exposed to it more.
Okay.
Because that they are, for one thing, they're on an island and they're all sort of having a common experience. They're out there in the middle of nowhere, but they also have this extreme geography with the trench next to them, and yet in the middle of their island they have mountains that are over 4,000 feet high, and so there's a lot of interesting territory to explore. But the problem is that a lot of the people in Puerto Rico have been taught to be paranoid of Americans, as they call us. Even though we're all U.S. citizens, they call us Americans from the mainland, and that goes back to the history of the island in general. Puerto Rico is one of the most invaded places historically. I mean, over the past 500 years, all the world's greatest superpowers have fought over it. Obviously you had the Spanish that took it, and then the Spanish were fighting the English and the French and the Dutch, and when the United States got it in 1898, we were just sort of the latest invaders. And then, of course, when the Cold War came around, you had all this business between Russia and Cuba and Puerto Rico, and messages being sent back and forth. So there has been a lot of political intrigue there. There have been some terrible incidents of violence where U.S. military forces have literally dropped bombs on Puerto Ricans and killed them and shot them. There are plenty of experiments that have taken place on the island, eugenics experiments where Puerto Rican women were being sterilized without their knowledge. Things that are smack of the Tuskegee type experiments. You have all kinds of biological experiments where they brought invasive species over, various monkeys and things, and gave them diseases, and some of those monkeys escaped and are now a nuisance on the island. So and you have secret bases to this day all over the place, and so people have been kind of taught there to sort of mind their own business. And so it took a while for me to go in there, again, looking very obviously out of place. I'm 6'2", I'm from North Carolina, my Spanish is not that great, and a lot of people said that I looked like a lot of the military dudes that they would encounter. And so it took a long time for me to convince people to warm up and start talking to me. But what I found was that, the people there, they're open to it because they've seen it more, but they're also often frightened to talk about it, and that's changing a little bit more now, thanks to the internet and people just opening up more in general. But prior to the internet, it was a very risky business, and people have been threatened about discussing this stuff, similar to the stories you hear related to the Roswell incident.
It's a beautiful place. I've been there a couple times myself, not for research purposes like you were. I was there just for fun and leisure time, but it is a beautiful place, something I recommend everyone to visit and check out those photographs. Again, we'll link over to joshuapwarren.com in the show notes. We'll give you those direct links so you can find everything we're talking about. So, Joshua, let me switch gears a little bit, bring you back to the mainland America, into the deserts of Area 51. Now, around the time you and I met, you had told me about some of these experiments that you were doing, and within days of meeting you, this kind of avalanche of media attention came down on a discovery you made of either a time warp or time slowing down. I mentioned this a couple episodes ago here on the Black Vault Radio, but I'm glad to bring you aboard specifically to talk to that. So can you just tell me, what was the experiment and what did you find?
Yes, it's really serendipitous how all this worked out, because I have been doing a lot of work in the Vegas area, shooting some TV programs and doing some live events, and so I spend enough time out here that I decided to get a part-time residence here. I've been meaning to go to Area 51 for a while, and it's really funny how all this worked out. I had the perfect opportunity arise. I was contacted by a Silicon Valley engineer named Ronald Heath. And turns out that he had emailed me a couple of times over the years regarding one thing or another, but I didn't recognize him right off the bat. And he said, "I have created a meter for the guy who has every other kind of meter in the world." And that immediately got my attention, because I am a big geek. I have tons of tools and devices, and I love taking them out and measuring things. And so Ronald Heath has a long history of creating all kinds of really interesting circuits related to, again, Silicon Valley kind of stuff. But he always has had this side interest regarding UFOs. And he said that he was especially inspired by an episode years ago of The X-Files, in which Mulder takes a stopwatch and places it at his car, and then he walks to a UFO hotspot with a second stopwatch, and then later he compares the two and finds that they are running at a slightly different time. And so, the idea being that maybe there was something about that environment or the technology being used in that environment that was warping gravity, which would therefore change the rate at which time flows. He also said that there have been a number of projects over the years, like Project Starlight, he mentioned in the 1970s, which had indicated similar things occurring. So he created this device called a differential time rate meter, or DT meter, that would basically document this sort of thing. The device operates quite simply. It's very user-friendly. On one end, you have a box that has a display that says 0.00000, and it's hooked to a 100-foot cable, and on the opposite end of the cable is a sensor.
Okay.
And so the idea is that you stretch this cable out all the way after you've calibrated the device, and the sensor is constantly sending a signal back and forth between the meter and the sensor, and it's comparing these 2 points. And the idea is that if time is flowing normally, that signal will always reach at a consistent rate of time at that particular spot. And the only thing that's supposed to change that is if a black hole approaches Earth, which is not supposed to be happening right now. And so according to everything in the classroom textbooks, he basically created a meter that's not supposed to pick up anything. It's always supposed to read normally,
which is the zeros.
And so, yeah, it's supposed to be zeros, but just to make it even more accurate, there is a 3-digit margin of error on the end. So you just completely ignore the bottom right 3 digits, because you're getting into nanoseconds there, and that's just to be extra safe, to make sure that there's no background noise or any kind of problem with the circuitry or whatever that's showing up. I mean, that's a very wide margin of error. So you only start paying attention if you pick up some kind of a deviation at the fourth digit from the right, which is microseconds. So what that means is if you take a second and you split it into 100,000 pieces, one of those is called a microsecond.
Okay.
And so, again, we can't really comprehend how how short of a duration that is. But it's still substantial when it comes to measuring this sort of time anomaly. Well, he created these devices, and he had not told anybody about it yet. He had two of them he's had running for months in California, and he has never gotten one anomalous reading.
Okay.
So I was the first person to receive one of these to take it out into the field. And so instantly I thought, wow, I should take this to Area 51 because I've heard of all these rumors about technology being used there, which somehow manipulates gravity and therefore time.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, the most famous report comes from the very controversial Bob Lazar.
Mm-hmm.
I saw Bob Lazar in person a couple years ago at the International UFO Congress, where he got on stage and he was talking about working on one of these UFO engines at S4 there at Area 51, and he said he had an engine that was slightly larger than a basketball, and it was distorting gravity and space-time to such a degree that you could put a candle next to it, and that the candle flame would actually freeze in midair,
Wow.
showing that time was frozen there.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought, okay, Area 51, Groom Lake, all that, it's a very, very big facility. So if they are working on something like that, maybe if I take this device up there, I'll just get some kind of little deviation. So I planned a trip just for my wife, Lauren, and myself. I didn't tell anybody exactly where I was going except for a few friends in case I got, abducted or something. And the idea was that I would drive hundreds of miles from Las Vegas up to Area 51, spend the night, and come back. And along the way, I would stop in the desert every 20 or 30 miles and take measurements.
Okay.
So, of course, and that way I'd have some controls,
Mm-hmm.
and I could sort of compare, and not only using the DT meter, but I also had some other stuff, some Geiger counters, some radio microwave detectors, night vision goggles, third gen night vision, all that kind of stuff. And so, but I was hoping, I was like, wouldn't it be cool if, like, we travel all the way up there and all the readings are normal, and then we get to Area 51 and we get something weird. That's what I was envisioning might happen. Well, it turns out that's not what happened. We went all the way to Area 51, taking all these measurements, and then again spent the night and came back. But the only place where I got something that was outstanding was in the middle of the desert, about 20 miles north of Las Vegas. Nondescript area on the side of the road where I just happened to pull over because they had been doing some road construction for a while, and they had some traffic cones which prevented me from pulling over. And so I finally had an opportunity, so we pulled over. We stretched the device out. I calibrated it, and all of a sudden, boom, there it was. I got what to this day is the only anomalous reading that has ever been captured with one of these devices. It showed that time had slowed down by 20 microseconds for a moment.
Okay.
And so I was like, wow, that's pretty cool. So I videotaped this whole thing. I got it all documented. At that time, I wasn't sure just how outstanding it was. When I finally got back and I was compiling all my data, I sent that result to Ronald Heath, and he wrote back and said, wow, that is incredible. And I talked to him on the phone, and he says, nobody's ever gotten an anomalous reading with this thing or any of these things,
Mm-hmm.
And so it just so happens, and this I think is the kicker, just so happens that this little nondescript part of the desert where I stopped is also one of the top UFO hotspots in the area where some of the strangest lights have been filmed in the sky at night. And so
And that
that
was this
seems to
spot
be,
where you saw time slow down. That was
that's
that.
correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is
So
it?
that seems a bit much for coincidence, perhaps, right?
Yeah. And let me ask you. You said it's about 20 miles outside of Vegas. I believe Area 51 is considered 90. Do I have that right? I'm not local, so I could be wrong on that. But it's about 90 miles outside of the heart of Vegas, right?
Oh, it's a lot farther than that.
Oh, it's farther than I thought. It was like 90. Okay.
Uh,
So about how far, and where I'm going with this is, could this be a flight line? Is that why it's a UFO hotspot? Do you have any theories on that, on why this particular spot over everything else?
well, it's interesting to think that when it comes to Area 51 in general, that facility is so giant that it's very easy and convenient to sort of tie it into any conspiracy
Yeah.
in Nevada. But I found it intriguing that this was, closer to the city. I mean, it was still in the middle of nowhere, but it was closer to the city. And so I'm thinking that maybe one of three things happened here. Either number one, there is some kind of technology that may have been developed around Area 51 that is being experimented with a little closer to civilization, and I happened to be there at the right place and time to see uh, a little wrinkle in time
Hmm.
because of that. Or number two, there happened to be some kind of a UFO that was flying nearby at that time. Now, this was about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. It was very bright and sunny. So I may not have noticed. And that's one of the ironic things about doing this kind of research. Often you have your nose stuck in the equipment that's right in front of you, and you
Sure. You're
miss
not
it.
looking up.
If you look, yeah, if you looked up, there might have been a big saucer flying up there,
Yeah.
and then and number three is this also could be, and I believe honestly this is the most likely explanation. This could be a natural property of Earth that we might find that actually there are little time warps strewn all over this planet, especially at places like the Bermuda Triangle or Brown Mountain in western North Carolina, where the Brown Mountain lights appear, and so on. But up until now, people have not had this user friendly little device to go out and start testing things. And so now, because of this news story, there are a lot of people who are trying to get one of these. Ronald Heath has, he's only made a handful of them, but I got an email from a guy who actually works for NASA, who he bought one, and he's going to take it to all of these interesting sites. There are at least two other people I know of who now have one, and I'm suspecting that over time, as we compare our data, we might find that if you plot these places where these anomalies occur, and you overlay them with places where people experience strange phenomena, they might just match up and reveal a pattern of some kind. And I have been criticized by a lot of people for announcing my finding, even though I only had one incident where I got this one anomaly. But my response to that is, well, look, this is just the beginning. I mean, this is the very first data point that I've plotted here, and I want people to be able to follow along with this entire process of discovery
Hmm.
and perhaps even participate. I'm not sure that I have that grand design yet, but I really believe that this is the first stage, this is the first step, and that ultimately we will see some kind of a worldwide pattern that will emerge. And frankly, one of the reasons that I don't think that what I was able to document here outside of Las Vegas is as earth shattering as a lot of people who are saying, oh, come on, you're just making a bold claim, is because we know, based upon the work of Einstein and his successors, that time is a flexible thing,
Hmm.
and NASA has even done work with some sophisticated equipment demonstrating that time is also inconsistent. I mentioned the gravity map earlier. Well, in 2004, they had this project called Gravity Probe B, where they sent this craft around Earth measuring the space-time curvature around the planet with gyroscopes and all this, and it was pretty obvious that yeah, time does not flow evenly because gravity is not even. So to me, um, being able to document what I documented was a great first big step for those of us who are civilians who can now get out there and document something new in a fresh way.
Hmm.
But I think eventually I predict that we will find that these kinds of anomalies are all around our planet, and it won't even be that big of a deal.
You bring up an interesting kind of correlation between this finding and Bob Lazar. Now, I'm going to be just straight up honest. I'm not 100% sold on his story, meaning I really don't know what the truth is. There's a lot of things that are interesting to me, and then in the same respect, there's a lot of red flags. There's kind of a mix of both. So I'm not sure what to think, but you bring in your research and you kind of find that correlation between his testimony, what the engines that he worked on can do, and what you're measuring out in the desert. Let me ask a skeptical question, if you don't mind, and that is just simply this device. Could it have malfunctioned? Is there any other logical explanation other than time slowing down where you could get this anomalous reading?
Oh, it's certainly possible that there could have been a malfunction. And of course, I think that that's not likely because that it's easy to calibrate, and I've used it on so many other occasions, and it's never given me anything weird. And all of the other units that have been running for months have never done anything weird. As a matter of fact, Ronald Heath has his units plugged up to a computer that is plotting their data 24/7, and he sent me screen captures of this. So, I mean, that combined with the fact that we know that time-space anomalies do exist makes me feel like that. Again, I mean, it's to me, it doesn't seem so extreme that we should even have to doubt what it captured. But I also realize that whenever it comes to science and the scientific method, scientific study is usually done with instruments, and we have to remind ourselves sometimes that every type of tool or instrument that exists was conceived by a human, built by a human, calibrated by a human, used by a human, interpreted by a human. You cannot remove the human element from this, no matter how hard we try. And humans are fallible, imperfect beings. And so, you can always say that any type of measurement that we take using a tool could be the product of some kind of flaw. But in this particular case, even though that's possible, again, from my point of view, I'm not that surprised by it. I mean, I think that it was a wonderful, lucky moment for me to be at the right place at the right time and get this. But I feel very confident that as time goes on and more people are out there doing this and we become more and more familiar with it, it'll be more commonplace. And I just was given the opportunity to be the first person to have one of these to take it out into the field.
Yeah, and outside, well, on the way, not directly outside, but on the way to Area 51, I think that was kind of a great execution on your part to kind of take those control samples, those control readings all the way up into Area 51, and you didn't get what you expected, which that in itself is pretty intriguing. Now, as we close up the interview with you, I wanted to ask you one thing. I mean, obviously, in the past, those that have pushed the frontiers of science are often either threatened or not only ridiculed. You talked a little bit about that already, but often threatened. I mean, have you gotten any threats, any people following you in dark cars? And before you answer that, let me bring up something to all of you listening that I'll be honest with you, I was a little apprehensive bringing it up. However, as you listen through this interview, this is the wonders of not being live and with a little bit of fancy editing that you probably didn't notice this. But during the course of this interview, Joshua and I have been disconnected now 4 different times in ways that it wasn't just a click off and we got disconnected. And I've got audio outputs now of what happened as Joshua was talking, and all of a sudden he just kind of fades out to nothing, and then the line is still there, but his audio goes. Now, I try not to read into stuff like that, But just to give everybody a reason why I'm bringing it up, before I launched the Black Vault Radio, I worked very hard to set up everything from a technical standpoint. And I did test interviews, meaning I did test recordings literally for hours, using the phone line, using my setup, and just let it run literally for hours, trying to emulate, what could go wrong. And I think I probably recorded 8 to 10 hours worth of just test in addition to the interviews I've done thus far. Not a single time has this ever happened. With Joshua here in this particular interview, it's happened 4 different times. So I've exported a couple of those audio dropouts, and again, my phone line never cut. He was still connected to me. I just couldn't hear him, and I assume he probably couldn't hear me, but my phone line stayed live. So that being said, I did extensive testing. I don't think it's a technical issue on my end. Maybe it's just a pure coincidence. But back to my question to you, Joshua, if you're still there, have you had any of these threats or people behind you?
Yeah, I'm glad that you bring this up, John, because, I do radio interviews all the time. I use this same setup. I mean, this story went so big. I mean, it was in Newsweek, Inside Edition. It made Drudge. It was on the main page of Fox News. I mean, I've done a lot of interviews, and I've never had this particular issue. In fact, when we were getting disconnected, I would see a little message pop up that says downloading conversation history. And I'm like, don't know what that means. But what this really makes me think of right off the bat is that I got these measurements. I got that particular measurement that we've been talking about on June the 18th of 2018. And then a few days later, the story was broken that I'd gotten some kind of weird result by Fox 5 here in Las Vegas. Within 90 minutes of them breaking this story, every device that I have started sending me all kinds of emergency alerts, texts through my phone, email on my computer saying, you're being hacked, you're being hacked, you're being hacked, change your passwords. And so I had to rush, and I already have really good security on all of my systems, by the way. But I had to go in and take whatever extra precautions, change all my passwords and everything. Now, that has never happened to me before. You might get an alert once in a while saying, you need to secure this thing or that thing, but not all my stuff. All my stuff at once within 90 minutes was telling me somebody's trying to access my information. And so, what's funny is that even if somebody out there thinks that what I've found here in my research is meaningless, or I'm just grandstanding or showboating or whatever you want to say to explain it, then I still think that the amount of interest that's been shown by the world and the fact that this is related to what's happening at Area 51 demonstrates that I am tapping into something here that that gives us some insight into these more exotic technologies that are being studied. And if you consider, John, here we are in this situation where last year the Pentagon, oddly enough, found it appropriate to start disclosing some of the stuff that they're doing with UFOs here in the Vegas area. And now we have President Trump announcing the formation of the Space Force, which will include Area 51 and the work they're doing there. This is very interesting timing, and so I have a feeling that my work as a civilian here may be tapping in at a particularly sensitive time to something that they're working on that will be revealed more as time goes on.
Well, I wish you the best of luck. I don't know what to think of it. I wanted to point it out to the audience, though, because the first time it happened, I thought, okay, well, maybe, my phone disconnected. Obviously, 4 times within 45 minutes, I think, or 50 minutes in, to have that happen within 50 minutes 4 different times. I'll export the audios. Joshua, I'll get your permission too, but just to kind of put those online so people can hear the dropouts. It's not something Joshua can do on his end. I'm sorry. I mean, he'd have to have a kind of an elaborate setup to get this particular type of fade out, and so it's definitely a technical something rather. So I'll let you guys decide that are listening. But there definitely has always been a weird history with those that truly have pushed the walls of science. And if Joshua is onto something here, who knows? Maybe the government is listening in. Maybe they don't want us to talk. Or maybe it's all just a fantastic coincidence. Who really knows? But I'll let you all decide. Joshua, it's been fascinating, man. I really do appreciate you coming on. You're welcome anytime you'd like to come back. We'll talk about your current experiments, see what you're researching. And I know that there's probably a heck of a lot more to dive into in your history. So I really do appreciate your time.
Well, you are a great pioneer, John. Thank you for what you do. It's been a wonderful conversation, and thank you for having me on.
It's my pleasure, and thanks again. Now, although that concludes my interview with Joshua P. Warren, don't go away. Up next, I'll profile a document that tells one of the most sinister stories I have ever found when it comes to government cover-ups. It deals with an unauthorized experiment, LSD, and an alleged suicide. That's next on TBV Unredacted. In this episode's TBV Unredacted, I want to profile a document that I received that is all about MK Ultra. Now, you already heard me talk a little bit about MK Ultra in the beginning of the show because, well, there's new things, new developments going on with my FOIA fight with the CIA regarding behavioral modification documents, which I believe are connected to MK Ultra. The CIA is saying no, and it's creating a little bit of an issue. Now, as that unfolds, I think it's fitting with that all being said and talked about in the beginning of the show, that I speak about this particular document that came from the CIA. Now, this was part of the hearing, the congressional hearing that took place on August 3rd, 1977, when news began really kind of spreading about MK Ultra and what shady things the CIA was really doing. I've linked this in the show notes, but I want to give you the overall synopsis of what happened. And this congressional testimony, let me preface it with Congress was tipped off. It had leaked about MK Ultra, and the fact that the CIA was undergoing these fairly inhumane, immoral, pick a word, experiments involving LSD, hypnosis, and mind control. Now, there are literally hundreds and hundreds of different facets and stories and objectives and details about MK Ultra that I can go into. Just to name a few, MK Ultra was considered what's called an umbrella project. So not everything that undertook behavioral modification was part of MK Ultra, but generally, it would then reside in a sub-project of MK Ultra. MK Naomi, MK Delta, MK Often were just a select few of the project names that I'll mention and bring up. But one specific story has stuck out to me for years. And I want to bring it up because in this particular document, it talks about Dr. Frank Olson. Now, if you're interested in anything about mind control, check out the documents that I've posted. You'll probably cringe at some of the stuff that you might read, but I guarantee this one will probably get you the most. And the story about Dr. Frank Olson, when I first learned about it, was in this specific record, in this congressional testimony and document that transcribed a lot of the testimony of those that were involved, that were subpoenaed and brought forward to speak about MK Ultra, because ultimately all the documents were destroyed, or at least the majority of them were. They later did find boxes of material, which is what you see on the Black Vault. That was all misfiled as financial records. However, there was a lot more to that was destroyed. It's believed that Richard Helms, who was not the director at the time of MK Ultra, but ultimately became the director, was heavily involved in some of the experimentation and the authorizations that were given for these MK Ultra experiments. Now, one towards the end of the project was done on a group of CIA scientists, and what they were trying to do was to see how vulnerable our own people really were. With the training that we've given them, the knowledge that they had, so on and so forth, if the Soviet Union were to capture one of them, and they were to use the same techniques that MKUltra was ultimately trying to figure out and master, which was the mind control and the way to make someone else's mind have essentially no walls, that you can extract information from them. If they were able to master that, well, so could our enemies. And so what they wanted to see was, let's do these tactics that we've been working on against our own. What made it even worse was they didn't tell anybody. They didn't tell their victims when they took them on this retreat. They were under the impression, these CIA scientists and personnel were under this impression that it was more of a meeting or a retreat. Now, during dinner, they were all given LSD and a glass of Cointreau that they were given for dessert. The experiment went a bit awry. One of them did not drink, so therefore he didn't get the LSD. As they started really exhibiting drunk qualities, as the story goes, they weren't really focusing in this and that. They essentially called off the experiment, that they weren't going to try and grill these guys and see what they could deduce from it. But rather, the retreat ended, they went home. They were told that they were subjected to this experiment and given LSD. I can imagine they weren't too thrilled with all of that, but one of them was Dr. Frank Olson. Now, as Dr. Olson went back to his family, he started getting incredibly paranoid, very schizophrenic. He definitely had some adverse reactions to this LSD. Now, he was sent to upstate New York to a quote-unquote CIA-approved psychiatrist to try and figure out what was going on with Dr. Olson. I mean, this wasn't normal. This is not how he normally acted. But something affected him, whether his body just didn't take to the LSD or he had some kind of adverse reaction, or maybe he just mentally cracked because of what the CIA, his bosses, were doing to him. That, whatever the answer was, he goes to the psychiatrist and then comes home for Thanksgiving after a few sessions. Everything's still not right. So as the story goes, he goes back up to New York and he goes through another session or two. And as the testimony goes, he lunged himself, according to the CIA agent who was in the room with him, lunged himself out the window in the middle of the night, killing himself. Now, I stress the point that the CIA officer was in the room. Now, why do I bring this up? Therein lies the conspiracy theory. The conspiracy theory is that Dr. Olson was essentially a problem, that they needed to get him taken out, that they needed him to just go away because he wasn't. He was a problem. He was the byproduct of this botched experiment by the CIA, and didn't take to the LSD that they gave him without his knowledge, let alone approval. And now he's committed suicide, or so the story goes. But there's been a large push by Dr. Olson's son, Eric Olson, who truly believes that his father was killed rather than committed suicide. Now, I spoke to Dr. Frank Olson's son many years ago, and they have since made a documentary called Wormwood, which airs on Netflix. I would definitely recommend you watch it. I don't believe that it's 100% accurate across the board, but one of the guests that I really do want to get, not confirmed yet, but I do want to reach out and get a confirmation because I want to bring on Dr. Frank Olson's son, Dr. Eric Olson, bring him on to really tell the story, because this man has done more research on this than I could ever imagine doing. Since I stick with documents and the majority of MKUltra records are destroyed, it's very hard to get answers. But Dr. Olson, again, the son of Frank Olson, who was killed during this time, he still to this day is looking for answers. And his story is amazing. When you watch his interview on Wormwood, that documentary on Netflix, just look at the pain that this has caused him and his family. And look at the information that he's been able to collect over the years to show that this is much more than just a simple suicide. That the cover story, he believes it's a cover story, is hiding a much more sinister truth. So I want to highlight this congressional testimony because this document, again from 1977, when Congress and the Senate was convened to essentially look at MKUltra and see what the CIA really did, this document is probably one of the most detailed, including those interview transcripts. It's 174 pages long. It is something that if you are interested in this topic, look at it, because the testimony of many of these guys is pretty fascinating. And then you ultimately see the details of Dr. Frank Olson and essentially what kind of a problem that whole story really was. I'll end it with this. Years after the MKUltra experiments, one of the CIA quote-unquote assassination manuals was released and declassified. When you look inside the assassination manual, one of the ways that they talk about assassinating is throwing somebody out of a window, framing it as a suicide in order to essentially disconnect yourself from the event. Make it look like a suicide, people generally aren't going to ask too many questions. That was in the CIA manual's handbook. I have that as well, but it definitely is something that I should close this story with, because that's exactly what happened to Dr. Frank Olson. I really do hope to get Dr. Eric Olson, his son, on the show, because I do believe this story is one to be told, and one to be told in great detail. I'd love to know his opinion, too, on Wormwood, the final cut, and how it aired on Netflix, if he's happy with it, not happy. Again, I do know that there are some factual inconsistencies, but for the most part, it was very, very well done, something I highly recommend. And if you don't mind 174 pages of congressional and Senate testimony, definitely check out that document that I'm profiling right here on TBV Unredacted. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned at least one thing throughout the interview and throughout these various segments. I am really excited for next episode, and that guest will be posted on the website pretty soon. So make sure you subscribe, www.theblackvault.com/show notes. That will load all of the episodes, all of the links that I've talked about, links to the documents, the photographs, how to subscribe to this radio show, radio program, and also I will be posting instructions on how you guys can submit your questions for upcoming guests. That's all coming up on the Black Vault Radio. Thanks for listening.